A function is a block of code designed to perform a particular task. Here we've got an example of a simple function named add that prints the sum of 2 and 3. To define a function, we need to start by using the keyword function. This tells JavaScript to interpret the following code as part of our function definition. Next, we have the name of our function, which in this case is called add. It doesn't necessarily need to be called this. You can name your function whatever you want. After the name, we define something called function parameters, which are surrounded by these parentheses. For the sake of simplicity, we did not define parameters in our function. However, if we did, then our function would be able to take in arguments. Typically, functions that take in arguments are more dynamic and more reusable. Don't worry if this is not making any sense at all. We'll go into more detail about this later on in the video. Lastly, we have the body of our function. All of the statements within these curly braces are what make up our function body. These are the actions that the function will take when it is being executed. Now, if we want to execute this function, we need to call it. To better demonstrate this, let's move to our code editor. Now that we have our function on our code editor, let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. Refresh the page and we can see that nothing's actually being printed on our console. And the reason why is because all we've done is define our function, but we haven't actually executed it yet. To execute it, we need to call it using the function name, followed by a pair of parentheses and a semicolon. Now if we run this, we can see that we actually get our desired value, which is 5. So now that we know how to call a function using a function call here, let's talk about when and why we should use function parameters. Let's say hypothetically that we want to change our function so that it'll print the sum of 10 plus 11 instead of 2 plus 3. But we don't really want to keep changing the function definition when we change the values. So every time we're like, maybe we should do 10 plus 12, change it to 10 plus 12, or 14. That's a bit of a hassle and it's not really efficient. And it doesn't really make the function dynamic and reusable, which is one of the defining features of a function. And a great way to solve this is by using parameters. So let's start by defining some function parameters. I'm going to define 2 of them, one called num1 and the other called num2. Now instead of adding 2 static values like 1 plus 2, we're going to do num1 plus num2. And what this does is now whatever number is being passed into num1 and num2, those will be the numbers that are added together and printed out onto the screen. Now you might be wondering, okay, in that case, where do we pass in the numbers? Well, we can actually pass in the numbers as arguments in our function call. So here's our function call, and inside of these parentheses, we can specify our arguments. And before we do that, we need to look at the function and see, okay, this function has 2 parameters, so that it's expecting 2 arguments. So let's pass 2 arguments. We'll do 5 and 2. Now, once this line of code is executed, it'll call this function and pass in the value 5 to num1, and then pass in the value 2 to num2. And then it'll console.log the sum of these 2 numbers, which will equal 7. So let's go ahead and run that and make sure that our math is correct. And we get 7. Parameters really bring out the defining features of a function, which are that it's reusable, more dynamic, and really flexible. And what I mean by that is we can use this very same function call, but instead pass in different arguments, like let's say 1 and 2, 2 and 2, 3 and 2. And if we run this, we'll get all different values because now the result of num1 and num2 are predicated on the arguments that are passed in to the function call. Okay, now that we understand why and when we should use parameters, let's talk about how we can use functions to return values. You might be wondering, what exactly does it mean to return a value from a function? I know personally this was something I had a lot of trouble understanding at first. The best way I can show you is through example. So let's say that instead of printing the sum of num1 and num2, we want to return it to a variable. To do this, instead of printing, we will use the keyword return, followed by the value that we want to return, which can be just num1 and num2. If it helps you visualize, you can assign num1 and num2 to a variable plus num2. So this is just another way of doing it. Both ways work. But this is a little bit easier to read. We can see that we are adding num1 and num2 and assigning it to the variable sum, and then we're returning the variable sum. To return this to a variable, we have to first create a variable. So I'm going to create a variable called total and assign it to a function call like this, 5 plus 5. And let's go ahead and clean up real quick. And what's actually happening here is total is being assigned to whatever this function evaluates to. And what I mean by that is when this function is executed, it'll pass in 5 to number 1 and 5 to number 2, add those two, assign it to the variable sum, and return the variable sum back to here. So in essence, it'll kind of look like let total equal sum. And sum is, we both know, would be equal to 10 in this case. So if we print this out, you can actually see that total will be equal to 10. So I'm just going to put total colon and print out the variable total. And if we go ahead and run this, we can see that total is equal to 10. And that's because total is assigned to whatever value that was returned from this function call. That, in essence, is how a return statement works in a function. That about sums up my basics of JavaScript functions. I hope this was helpful to you, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Don't forget to leave a comment and let me know what you want to see in the next video. See you in the next one.